By 1944, the tide of World War II was beginning to turn. Hitler's forces, which had once surged across Europe with unstoppable momentum, were now being pushed back on the Eastern Front by the relentless advance of the Soviet Red Army. The German army was suffering from the strain of a multi-front war, yet the Third Reich remained a formidable power, especially in the West. The Allies, understanding that the final blow to Nazi Germany could only be delivered from Europe itself, had spent years planning a massive seaborne invasion that would ultimately change the course of history. This invasion, later known as D-Day, required months of preparation, innovation, and careful deception to stand any chance of success. Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had long been certain that at some point, an Allied invasion of continental Europe would be essential. As early as 1941, he was advocating for operations that would weaken Germany's hold over occupied territories and give Allied forces a foothold on the European mainland. But the questions of when, where, and how to strike remained unresolved. To prepare for such an invasion, the Allies began a series of raids and reconnaissance operations to probe German defenses and gather intelligence about the enemy's capabilities. The first of these raids came in December 1941, when British commandos carried out a daring operation on the Faroe Islands off the coast of Nazi-occupied Norway. The aim was to destroy critical coastal installations, tie down German troops in the region, and test their defensive responses. The raid was a success, with the commandos demolishing a fish oil factory and several coastal fortifications before withdrawing safely. Encouraged by this, the Allies decided to attempt a more ambitious raid on the French port of Dieppe 8 months later. The Dieppe raid, however, was a catastrophe. Canadian and British forces approached the heavily fortified port, only to be met with withering German fire. Landing craft were destroyed, soldiers were pinned down behind obstacles, and supporting tanks became immobilized on the shingle beaches. Over 3,000 Allied soldiers were killed or captured, a devastating loss that underscored the dangers of a direct assault on a fortified port. While the disaster was tragic, it provided invaluable lessons. Planners realized that a successful invasion would require careful preparation, overwhelming firepower, innovative technology, and meticulous coordination. The operation could not be rushed. By April 1943, at an Allied conference in Washington, Churchill and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed on a tentative plan for the invasion of France. Operation Overlord, as it was codenamed, would take place in the summer of 1944, but the Germans, ever watchful, were already preparing their defenses. Since the winter of 1941, the Germans had been constructing the Atlantic Wall, a massive system of fortifications stretching along Europe's western coast from Denmark to the Spanish border. Gun emplacements, minefields, barbed wire, and other obstacles were strategically positioned to repel any Allied landing. Hitler, proud of these fortifications, boasted that he was the greatest builder of defenses of all time. By 1942, German efforts intensified. Troop numbers along the coast were increased, yet the vastness of the coastline, nearly 2,000 miles, meant that forces were thinly spread. Commanders faced difficult choices. Field Marshal Gerd von Reunet, overall commander in the West, proposed holding a large reserve of panzer divisions inland near Paris, ready to counterattack wherever the invasion occurred. In contrast, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with defending the northern French coast, insisted that the Allies would have to be stopped at the beach itself. He had witnessed the effectiveness of Allied air power in North Africa and feared any inland counterattack would be decimated before it could begin. Hitler compromised. Von Reunet received a small reserve, while the majority of German forces were stationed along the coast as Rommel recommended. This divided strategy left the Germans vulnerable. Too few reserves meant that reinforcements could not arrive quickly, and panzer divisions were too far from potential landing sites. Meanwhile, the Allies faced their own challenges. They had to decide where to land the invasion forces. The two main options were Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France, and Normandy, farther west along the French coast. Pas-de-Calais offered a shorter sea crossing and a direct route to Germany, but it was the most obvious choice, and intelligence suggested the Germans expected it. General Frederick Morgan, chief planner of the operation, chose Normandy to achieve surprise, a decision that would hinge on deception and meticulous preparation. Reconnaissance of the Normandy coast was intense. Allied photo-reconnaissance aircraft flew countless missions, and the French resistance provided crucial intelligence. Resistance members secretly collected sand samples to test whether armored vehicles could traverse the beaches. Engineers studied fortifications, noting obstacles, minefields, and the strength of the German defenses. Every beach, cliff, and hedge was scrutinized. The goal was to ensure that when the first wave of soldiers landed, they would have the best chance of overcoming the enemy. Innovative technology was developed to solve the logistical challenges of the invasion. After deep, planners realized that attempting to assault a fortified port would be too dangerous. Instead, they designed mulberry harbors, enormous artificial ports that could be towed across the English Channel and assembled off the Normandy coast. These harbors allowed supplies, fuel, and reinforcements to reach the troops without capturing a major port immediately. Engineers also devised a complex system of pipelines, codenamed Pluto, to deliver fuel across the channel directly to the beachheads. Specialized vehicles, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, were developed by British engineer General Percy Hobart to overcome German defenses. These included flail tanks for clearing mines, amphibious tanks for crossing water obstacles, armored ramps to scale cliffs, and floating tanks to traverse shingle beaches. The Funnies were a critical innovation, increasing the chances that troops could advance from the beaches despite the heavy fortifications. Deception was another essential component of the plan. Operation Bodyguard was launched to mislead the Germans about the invasion location and timing. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, fake radio transmissions, and even a fictitious army group, the first U.S. Army group, Falaise, were positioned in southeast England. General Patton, famous for his aggressive leadership, was used as a decoy commander to convince the Germans that he would lead the main invasion at Pas-de-Calais. The Germans fell for the ruse, diverting attention and resources away from Normandy. By the autumn of 1943, all these elements were coming together. The Allies had assembled more than 2 million troops in England, supported by over 3,000 tanks and 12,000 aircraft. Every detail was planned: the timing of airborne drops, the bombardment of German positions, and the landing schedules for each beachhead. Supplies were stockpiled, soldiers trained on mock beaches, and engineers rehearsed the deployment of mulberry harbors and funnies. Yet despite the careful planning, uncertainties remained. By early June 1944, every element of the Allied invasion of Normandy was in place. Months of careful planning, reconnaissance, and deception had prepared the stage for what would become the largest seaborne invasion in history. But despite meticulous preparation, the stakes were enormous. Success or failure hinged on timing, coordination, and the ability of the troops to overcome formidable German defenses along the Atlantic Wall. The Allies had launched Operation Bodyguard, a massive deception campaign, to mislead the Germans about the location and timing of the invasion. The Germans believed the main attack would come at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing from Britain to France. Inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft were positioned in southeast England, complete with false radio transmissions to simulate the presence of a large army. The Allies even created a fictional force, the first U.S. Army Group, Falaise, under the apparent command of General George Patton, making him the enemy's expected invasion leader. In reality, Patton would be nowhere near Normandy. His role was simply to convince German intelligence that the main strike would be elsewhere. As the final hours approached, Allied paratroopers and glider-borne forces prepared for their pivotal role in the invasion. Dropping behind enemy lines in the darkness, they were tasked with securing key bridges, road junctions, and villages to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Their operations would sow confusion and disrupt German command, creating openings for the amphibious landings to follow. The weather posed a significant challenge. Storms across the English Channel delayed the initial attack, forcing General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, to make a nerve-wracking decision. On the evening of June 5, 1944, Eisenhower convened his commanders. The naval officers were eager to proceed, but the air chiefs were cautious, warning that poor visibility could compromise air support. After long deliberation, Eisenhower gave the order, "Let's go." In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the operation began. British aircraft towed gliders toward Normandy, carrying troops who would capture vital bridges and airfields. Paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions descended behind enemy lines near villages like Saint-May-Église. Fierce firefights erupted immediately as small units struggled to secure their objectives. Despite heavy resistance, within hours key positions were captured, ensuring the success of the incoming amphibious landings. The main invasion fleet, an armada of more than 5,000 vessels, approached the Normandy coast under cover of darkness. Over 2 million troops were embarked, supported by 3,000 tanks and 12,000 aircraft. Allied ships and aircraft launched a synchronized bombardment of German positions along the coast, targeting gun emplacements, bunkers, and defensive obstacles. The first waves of landing craft headed toward 5 primary beaches, each with its own code name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Utah Beach, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division faced relatively light opposition. Using the element of surprise and aided by the airborne troops who had already secured inland positions, they were able to link up quickly and establish a strong beachhead. Supplies and reinforcements flowed rapidly, allowing the Americans to prepare for the inland advance. At Omaha Beach, however, conditions were far more challenging. The beach was narrow, backed by high cliffs, and heavily defended by German machine gun nests and artillery. Many landing craft were hit before reaching the shore, and troops were pinned under withering fire. Amphibious tanks, designed to support the infantry, were swamped or destroyed by obstacles and enemy fire. Chaos reigned as soldiers struggled to reach the beach and find cover. Against all odds, a few units managed to scale the cliffs using ropes, ladders, and sheer determination. Hours of brutal fighting eventually allowed the Americans to secure a tenuous foothold. Further east, the British 50th Infantry Division landed at Gold Beach. Resistance was fierce, but innovative vehicles, known as Hobart's funnies, proved critical. Flail tanks cleared mines, armored ramps allowed troops to scale obstacles, and specialized tanks laid paths across shingle and sand. These inventions, combined with careful coordination and artillery support, enabled the British to advance inland and link with adjacent forces. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces faced similar challenges. German defenses were strong, but the Canadians, supported by British funnies, successfully overcame the obstacles and moved off the beach. By mid-morning, Canadian troops had linked with British forces, establishing a continuous front along the Normandy coast. On the far eastern flank, Sword Beach was assaulted by the British 3rd Infantry Division. Resistance here was patchy, and the commandos swiftly advanced, linking up with glider-borne troops who had secured the Caen Canal. By early afternoon, all 5 beachheads had been established. Despite heavy casualties, the initial objective had been achieved. The Allies were on French soil. German command was caught off guard. The operational commander for the northwest French coast, Field Marshal Rommel, was away visiting family in Germany, believing that the weather had postponed the invasion. His subordinate, General Friedrich Dahlmann, was over 100 miles from Normandy, participating in a war game exercise. Only von Rühnet, the overall commander for Western Europe, was at headquarters, but he could not move panzer reserves without Hitler's direct permission. Hitler himself was asleep and remained unaware of the invasion's progress for several crucial hours. By midday, the scale of the invasion became apparent, but German forces were too disorganized and distant to mount an effective counterattack. Rommel, von Rühnet, and Dahlmann all faced a situation that no amount of planning could have fully prepared them for. The Allies had achieved surprise, concentrated overwhelming force, and landed across a wide front. Even the most experienced German commanders realized that they were reacting to events rather than controlling them. By the end of D-Day, over 100,000 Allied troops had landed on Normandy's beaches, facing intense resistance, yet holding their positions. Utah and Omaha beaches were critical American victories, while Gold, Juno, and Sword represented significant British and Canadian achievements. The airborne operations inland had disrupted German communication and movement, allowing the amphibious forces to consolidate their gains. The success of the first day was not merely a testament to Allied bravery. It reflected the meticulous planning, intelligence gathering, and innovative engineering that made the invasion possible. Soldiers, engineers, pilots, and commanders all played crucial roles, from building artificial harbors and specialized tanks to coordinating paratrooper drops and naval bombardments. D-Day marked the beginning of the Allied campaign to liberate Western Europe. The beachheads were secure, but the fighting was far from over. German forces would regroup, counterattack, and attempt to contain the invasion. The Normandy countryside, with its small fields, hedgerows, and fortified villages, would become a brutal battlefield in the days to come. Yet the success of June 6 demonstrated that the Allies could coordinate land, sea, and air forces on an unprecedented scale. With the beaches of Normandy firmly in Allied hands, the focus shifted to consolidating the landings and pushing inland. The initial success of D-Day had been dramatic, but the challenges that lay ahead were daunting. The Normandy countryside, with its intricate network of hedgerows, small fields, and dense woodlands, favored the defenders. German troops, seasoned and well-equipped, had fortified villages, farmhouses, and crossroads, turning each natural feature into a defensive stronghold. The Allies quickly realized that advancing beyond the beaches would require extraordinary determination, careful coordination, and constant innovation. The first obstacle was the terrain itself. Normandy's patchwork of farmland was divided by high hedgerows, tall, dense earth and vegetation barriers that could conceal machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank positions. German defenders exploited these natural fortifications to maximum effect, ambushing advancing troops and slowing their progress. Tanks, often vital in overcoming fixed defenses, struggled in these fields. Their firepower and mobility were reduced by the obstacles and narrow lanes. Infantry, meanwhile, faced the terrifying combination of enemy fire and natural barriers, forcing them to fight for every yard of ground. Despite these challenges, the Allies relied on the combined arms approach that had been rehearsed for months. Air support proved essential in disrupting German supply lines, destroying fortifications, and softening enemy positions before ground assaults. Bombers targeted roads, bridges, and railways, cutting off German reinforcements from reaching the front lines. Paratroopers, already behind enemy lines, continued to sabotage communications and ambush convoys, slowing the arrival of fresh German troops. In the first days after D-Day, Allied forces attempted to capture strategic towns, the most important being Caen, a city in the center of the invasion front. Caen was vital because it controlled access to the interior of France and served as a hub for German troop movements. British and Canadian forces launched repeated assaults on the city, facing heavy artillery, minefields, and elite German units, including SS Panzer divisions. The fighting was intense and often resulted in high casualties. Streets, villages, and buildings became killing zones as infantry clashed with tanks and entrenched defenders. Meanwhile, in the west, American forces advanced toward Cherbourg, a port city on the Cotentin Peninsula. The capture of Cherbourg was crucial for supplying the invasion forces, as it could replace the artificial Mulberry harbors and allow faster movement of troops, vehicles, and supplies inland. The Germans, aware of its importance, fortified the city heavily. American troops faced a week of brutal, house-to-house fighting before finally securing Cherbourg. By then, retreating German forces had sabotaged much of the port infrastructure, delaying its operational use for another month. Throughout Normandy, German reinforcements were hampered not just by the Allies' air superiority, but also by the French resistance. Resistance fighters operated behind enemy lines, sabotaging roads and bridges, ambushing convoys, and destroying railways. One notorious example was a delay caused to the German WWII SS Panzer Division, which took over 2 weeks to cover a distance that should have taken only 3 days. This disruption significantly weakened German attempts to mount counterattacks against the invading forces. German command was in disarray during this period. Field Marshal Gerd von Rünert, overall commander of the Western Front, was dismissed in early July for perceived defeatism and replaced by Field Marshal Kluge, who had little experience with the Normandy theater. Rommel, Hitler's most respected field marshal, was severely injured in a strafing attack, removing another experienced leader from active command. Meanwhile, Hitler, notorious for micromanaging his generals, insisted on rigid control and refused to allow tactical retreats, leaving German forces vulnerable to encirclement. Amidst this chaos, Allied troops began to link their beachheads, forming a continuous front from Utah to Sword Beach. This consolidation was critical to prevent German forces from splitting the invading army and counterattacking isolated units. It also allowed the Allies to concentrate artillery, armor, and reinforcements, preparing for deeper advances into France. However, progress was slow and costly. The hedgerows forced infantry and armor to fight in close quarters, and every village had to be captured through intense street-by-street combat. One particularly difficult objective was the town of Cormont, a crossroads city controlling access to key roads and supply lines. American forces approached Cormont only to find themselves under heavy artillery fire and ambushes from German tanks hidden in wooded areas. Casualties were high, and progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Yet, the persistence of the troops, combined with continuous air bombardment and artillery support, eventually allowed the Allies to capture strategic positions and force German withdrawals. In addition to conventional fighting, psychological and logistical factors played a role. German troops were exhausted, under constant bombardment, and uncertain about the scale and location of the Allied invasion. Meanwhile, Allied forces had the advantage of superior numbers, better coordination, and relentless supply lines through Mulberry harbors and fuel pipelines. These advantages, combined with the resistance's sabotage efforts, gradually shifted momentum in favor of the Allies. The fighting during these weeks also highlighted the limitations of the German Atlantic Wall strategy. While fortified positions could delay and inflict casualties on the Allies, the lack of mobile reserves meant that once the beachheads were established, counterattacks could not be mounted effectively. Rommel's concern about panzer divisions being too far inland proved accurate. The Germans were unable to respond quickly enough to blunt the Allied advance. This failure would later contribute to the encirclement and destruction of German forces in Normandy. By mid-July 1944, the Allies had made significant progress despite the challenging terrain. Beachheads were secured, key towns had been captured or were under assault, and German forces were increasingly trapped and disorganized. The combination of air power, ground tactics, resistance activities, and engineering innovation, from Mulberry harbors to Hobart's funnies, demonstrated the effectiveness of Allied planning. Yet, the campaign was far from over. The Germans still held strongpoints in strategic locations, and the countryside continued to favor the defenders. The battle for Normandy was evolving into a slow, grinding struggle that would test the endurance, courage, and resourcefulness of every Allied soldier. Each day brought intense combat, logistical challenges, and the constant threat of counterattacks. Despite these difficulties, the initial success of D-Day and the subsequent fighting in Normandy showed that the Allies were capable of executing a coordinated, large-scale offensive that could eventually push Hitler's forces out of France. The stage was set for the next phase, a breakout from the beachheads deeper into France and ultimately toward Germany. But first, the Allies would have to continue grinding through the challenging hedgerows, fortified towns, and elite German units of the Normandy countryside. By late July 1944, the Normandy campaign had reached a critical phase. The Allies had secured their beachheads, fought through villages, and survived the deadly hedgerows of the Normandy countryside. However, progress had been slow, and casualties were mounting. The British and Canadians were locked in a bitter struggle around the city of Caen, while American forces faced stiff resistance from German units defending key positions in the west. Supplies and reinforcements had been flowing through Mulberry harbors, but the destruction of parts of these temporary ports by storms had slowed operations. The Allies needed a decisive breakthrough to capitalize on the gains of D-Day. That breakthrough came in the form of Operation Cobra, a bold plan devised by General Omar Bradley and the U.S. First Army to punch through German lines south of Cherbourg and advance rapidly into the French interior. The idea was to concentrate overwhelming force on a narrow sector of the front and use massive aerial bombardment to devastate German defenses. Over 1,800 Allied bombers were tasked with carpet bombing a 4-mile stretch of the German front line on July 25, 1944. The scale of the assault was unprecedented, aiming to destroy fortifications, troops, and artillery positions in a single, decisive blow. However, the execution of Operation Cobra was not without complications. The bombing was supposed to parallel the Allied lines, minimizing the risk to friendly forces. But due to miscalculations and poor visibility, some bombs fell short, tragically hitting American positions and killing over 100 U.S. soldiers. Despite this setback, the bombardment had a devastating effect on German morale and defenses. Survivors were disoriented, Communications were disrupted, and the once solid German front began to crumble under the weight of the assault. The ground offensive began immediately after the bombing. American infantry and tanks advanced rapidly through gaps in the German lines, exploiting the chaos caused by the aerial bombardment. Panzer divisions, already weakened by weeks of fighting and constant air attacks, were unable to mount a cohesive defense. Many German units were cut off, with limited supplies, under constant threat from Allied artillery and air strikes, and harried by French resistance fighters operating behind their lines. Roads were destroyed, bridges sabotaged, and convoys ambushed, further slowing the German response. In the north, British and Canadian forces continued their struggle around Caen and other fortified towns. Repeated assaults had been costly, as the Germans, particularly SS Panzer divisions, held key positions in towns and strongpoints. Yet, the success of the American breakout to the west created a strategic opportunity. German forces defending central and northern Normandy were now at risk of encirclement. The Allies began to link up their forces from different sectors, tightening the noose around the retreating Germans. By early August, the effect of Operation Cobra became apparent. U.S. forces, moving rapidly through the open country once they had broken through the hedgerows, captured key towns like Catances and Avranches, cutting off German retreat routes. The advance was relentless, combining infantry, armor, and tactical air support to prevent German units from regrouping. German troops, already demoralized by weeks of heavy losses, faced the terrifying reality of being encircled. Roads clogged with retreating units became death traps under Allied air attacks. The culmination of this maneuver came with the closing of the Falaise Gap in mid-August 1944. Allied forces advancing from the north and south converged, effectively trapping a large portion of the German 7th Army and other units in a pocket. Over 50,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, while thousands more were killed in desperate attempts to escape. The destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket marked a turning point in the Normandy campaign and opened the way for Allied advances into northern and eastern France. The collapse of German command and control played a crucial role in the success of this phase. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundert had already been dismissed in early July for defeatism and replaced by Field Marshal Kluge, who had limited knowledge of northwestern France. Rommel, injured and absent from the front, left German forces without one of their most experienced tacticians. Hitler's insistence on holding positions to the last man prevented orderly retreats, contributing to chaos and mass surrenders. Coordination among German units broke down, and reinforcements arrived too late or in insufficient numbers to halt the Allied advance. Patton's Third Army now took the lead in exploiting the breakthrough. Known for his aggressive tactics, Patton pushed his forces east and north, threatening to cut off the remaining German units in Normandy. Towns such as Le Mans and Alençon fell rapidly as German resistance collapsed under the combined weight of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power. With the northern and southern flanks of Normandy secured, the Allies had effectively destroyed the German front in the region, leaving only isolated pockets of resistance. Meanwhile, the British and Canadians continued their methodical advance from the eastern and central sectors. Though progress had been slower due to stronger fortifications and elite German defenders, the American success in the west relieved pressure on these units. With the German army's center and western sectors collapsing, British forces could now advance with reduced opposition, eventually capturing Caen and other key towns. Coordination among the Allies ensured that the encirclement of German forces was completed, maximizing the effectiveness of the breakthrough. Operation Cobra also highlighted the importance of combined arms warfare. Air power, artillery, tanks, and infantry worked together to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's lines. French resistance fighters played a crucial role behind German lines, sabotaging roads and communication networks, further amplifying the effects of the offensive. The campaign demonstrated how meticulous planning, deception, and innovation could overcome even the most stubborn and well-equipped defenders. By the end of August 1944, the situation in Normandy had dramatically changed. German forces were in full retreat, their divisions decimated, and command structures broken. Allied troops, advancing from multiple directions, had liberated large swaths of territory and opened the way for further offensives into France. The successes of Operation Cobra and the closing of the Falaise Gap ensured that the German army in the west could no longer mount significant counterattacks, marking a decisive turning point in the Western European campaign. The breakout from Normandy was not merely a military victory. It was a testament to the ingenuity, courage, and determination of the Allied forces. Months of preparation, planning, and innovation. From Mulberry Harbors to Hobart's Funnies, from deception operations like Bodyguard to the coordination of air, land, and resistance forces, had culminated in a stunning success. The battlefield lessons of Normandy would shape the remainder of the campaign in Western Europe and lay the foundation for the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Following the successful breakout from Normandy and the crushing defeat of German forces in the Falaise Gap, the stage was set for the Allies to liberate the rest of France. German forces in the west were in disarray, their units fragmented, supply lines destroyed, and morale shattered. The Allies seized the opportunity to push rapidly east and south, exploiting gaps in the enemy lines and using the momentum generated by months of planning, deception, and coordinated attacks. In the west, General George Patton's Third Army spearheaded the advance. Patton's forces moved with astonishing speed, sweeping through towns such as Le Mans and Alençon, cutting off retreating German units and capturing thousands of prisoners. German resistance in these areas was sporadic. Many units, exhausted and demoralized, offered only token opposition before fleeing. Allied aircraft relentlessly harassed retreating columns, destroying vehicles and artillery and preventing the Germans from regrouping or establishing new defensive lines. Meanwhile, to the north, British and Canadian forces continued their methodical advance, linking up with American units and securing key road and rail networks. Coordination between Allied armies ensured that German forces could not escape encirclement. Town after town fell to the advancing troops, with resistance from the Germans growing weaker by the day. The French resistance, emboldened by the Allied successes, rose in many cities and towns, sabotaging German operations, assisting in freeing prisoners, and helping guide the Allies through occupied territories. The liberation of Paris became a strategic and symbolic objective. The French capital, under German occupation since 1940, had been a center of administrative and military control for the Nazis. French resistance fighters, organized into local units, began to rise against the occupiers, seizing control of parts of the city and taking German collaborators prisoner. Their uprisings, combined with the advancing Allied forces, created a situation in which the Germans could not maintain control. American forces, moving northeast from the Western Front, approached the outskirts of Paris by late August 1944. The German garrison, aware of the encirclement, had orders from Hitler to defend the city to the last man, but the units were weakened, isolated, and demoralized. Instead of a prolonged urban battle, German commanders ultimately chose to withdraw, leaving key positions in the hands of retreating forces. On August 25, 1944, Allied troops entered Paris. The liberation was met with jubilant celebrations by the French population, who poured into the streets waving flags, cheering, and embracing the soldiers who had fought to free them. The French resistance, having controlled significant portions of the city, coordinated with Allied forces to restore order and remove remaining German stragglers. Paris, a symbol of French pride and cultural heritage, was finally free after 4 years of occupation. The liberation of Paris had profound strategic implications. It removed a critical German administrative and logistical hub, further weakening the already shattered Western Front. With the Allies controlling the major roads, railways, and ports, the advance into the interior of France became more efficient. German forces, now in full retreat, attempted to regroup along the Saar and Rhine rivers, but the speed and coordination of the Allied advance made organized defense increasingly impossible. Farther south, American forces carried out a secondary seaborne operation along the Mediterranean coast near Caen in southern France. This assault, although initially considered a diversion by British planners, proved crucial in clearing German forces from the southern regions. Paratroopers from the Free French Army, veterans who had escaped German occupation in Europe and North Africa, joined the landings. Their local knowledge and fighting experience facilitated rapid advances inland, liberating towns and villages along the Rhone Valley and linking up with Patton's Third Army advancing from the north. By early September 1944, the majority of France had been liberated. Allied forces had swept through Normandy, Brittany, the Loire Valley, and the south, capturing thousands of German soldiers and destroying key infrastructure. The speed and coordination of the campaign demonstrated the culmination of years of planning, deception, and logistical preparation. Mulberry harbors, pipelines, and supply chains had ensured that tanks, artillery, and infantry could advance without interruption, while their superiority prevented German forces from regrouping or counterattacking effectively. The collapse of German command in France was complete. Field Marshal Kluge, who had replaced von Rundert, struggled to coordinate the remaining units, many of which were cut off or surrounded. Hitler's insistence on holding positions to the last man continued to result in unnecessary losses, further eroding morale. Panzer divisions, once the backbone of German defensive power, were largely destroyed or trapped, leaving only scattered, disorganized units to slow the Allied advance. As the Allies pushed toward the German border, they faced fewer large-scale organized battles in France, but isolated resistance remained. German forces, often retreating through the countryside, employed delaying tactics, destroying bridges, and laying mines to slow the advance. Nevertheless, the combination of rapid armored thrusts, airborne operations, air support, and local resistance ensured that these tactics could not stop the overall momentum of the Allied armies. The liberation of France marked a turning point in World War II. After 4 years of occupation, the French people were free, and the Allies had established a firm foothold in Western Europe. The success of the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations highlighted the effectiveness of Allied planning, coordination, and innovation, from D-Day landings, deception strategies, and airborne operations to the construction of artificial harbors and use of specialized engineering vehicles. By September 1944, the Allies had not only freed France but were poised to advance into Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually Germany. The German army in the West was shattered, and Hitler's ability to control the front was critically weakened. Allied forces, combining the speed of Patton's Third Army, the methodical advances of the British and Canadian units, and the courage of paratroopers and resistance fighters, had achieved one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. The lessons of the Normandy campaign would echo through the remainder of the war. Meticulous planning, deception, coordination across land, sea, and air, and the resilience and courage of individual soldiers could overcome even the most formidable defenses. From the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword to the streets of liberated Paris, the Allied victory in France marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire in Western Europe.